and he will be talking about, there will be zeros. It's about zero inflated count data in behavioral HIV research. And next month, a presentation will be given by Dr. Rob Weiss, and he'll be presenting on the issue of multivariate longitudinal analysis of self-reported sexual behaviors. And that's going to be on April 1st. So I will turn the floor over to Scott.
Thank you, Jay. Well, with all the biostatistics professors, this brings back memories. I feel like I'm at a student seminar here.
This is your final defense.
Again.
Hey, Dallas. Oh, good.
Hey, Dallas.
We drink your milkshake.
That's right. All right, so I'm going to be giving an overview on how to analyze count data that has a lot of zeros in it. So as we know with count data, it can contain a larger proportion of zero responses than we can explain by a unimodal distribution. And I'll get into that with a picture in a minute, what I mean by the unimodal part. And common examples we encounter in research where we have zero inflated data would be from drug data, where we have a lot of non-users in the study, sexual behavior data, where we have a lot of abstinent participants, or medical expenditures, where you have healthy patients that just don't incur any costs, or defects in manufacturing if you have a low defect rate. So to kind of give an example of this, whoops, where's my second picture? Well, that was weird.
We have it here.
You have it here?
Yeah.
Okay. No, it doesn't. Now you guys have it there.
Yeah.
So I just came up with a little hypothetical example here on the left-hand side of what the regression assumes, that you have a unimodal distribution, or you really have one peak to the distribution, and what we usually see in research where there's actually two peaks. And in this example, the one peak is the zero counts, and then there's a second peak that's closer to 2 or 4. And this is just something I made up for frequency of use, substance use. So the common ways that we would analyze count data, we can leave it as a count and analyze it with a Poisson regression, or we can do some kind of transformation like a log transformation and analyze it with a linear regression. Or sometimes we dichotomize and run a logistic regression or categorize the count somehow. But the potential problems is we still assume that the counts can be described by a unimodal distribution, or if we dichotomize or categorize, this can lead to less power. So there's a whole lot of solutions out there in the literature. I'm just going to focus on a couple of solutions to the problem. One of the common solutions is to assume the zeros come from one process. And a good example of this can be in the medical expenditure literature, where only your sick patients are accruing medical costs, so the healthy patients are a separate group. They're kind of their own state. So in that case, we might want to assume that zeros just come from one process. If you're a zero, you're in that state, or if you're healthy, you're going to have some kind of costs accrued. Another approach that people take sometimes is they assume the zeros come from two processes. So to use an example from drug data, if you have a zero, it can be from a non-user, or it can be from a user who just wasn't using when they were assessed or interviewed. So the zeros can come from two processes. So if we assume the zeros come from one process, one approach that's pretty common in the literature is the, I forgot the word two-part there, but the two-part model for semi-continuous data, which was originally proposed by Naiwa Dwan and extended to longitudinal data by Olson and Schaefer. I'm not actually going to discuss that further here. I'll just make a few comments on it in a moment. The other model is the zero inflated Poisson model, which assumes zeros come from two processes. and there's a number of references for that. Just to comment on the two approaches, either the two-part model or the ZIP model from kind of my own experiences, and please add, it's great we have a lot of statistical people here to kind of generate some good discussion, but some of the things I've found with modeling longitudinal data using the ZIP model, it can be kind of hard to tease out that second process. And I've kind of found sometimes fitting the logistic part of the model can be kind of tricky. I've found the semi-continuous model can be easier to fit. There has been some simulation studies. I couldn't find the reference. I just remember I had read it at one point. And in the simulation studies, they looked at the properties of the ZIP model to see what if, the Poisson part of the model or the logistic part doesn't fit very well? How does that influence your overall estimates? And in their simulation, they found that even if the logistic part of the model doesn't fit very well, you still get pretty reasonable estimates in the Poisson part of the model. And did that just go down? Another nice thing with the two-part model is if you have cross-sectional data, it's very easy to fit. You can simply code your responses as a 0 or greater than 0, or kind of a yes-no response, and fit a logistic regression. And then you can take the positive responses and you can fit a linear regression. And that works out nicely because the likelihood actually separates for the cross-sectional case. Not quite so straightforward for the longitudinal case, but it can still be fit fairly simple. So the basic idea for the ZIP model is you fit the probability of having a 0, or what we call being in the 0 state, getting back to our drug example, being a non-user. You fit that in the logistic part of the model. And then in the Poisson part of the model, if you have a 0, you model the probability that that 0 comes from either being in the 0 state or being a 0 count from a Poisson distribution. And if you have a positive count, then you model that as a probability of not being in the 0 state in the Poisson count. And just to put up a formula there, I guess to go through this really quick, I won't spend too much time on it, but I basically just said in words what this is showing, that you assume your outcome, which is yijk, is 0 with some probability, pijk, or it comes from a Poisson distribution with the probability 1 minus pijk. And in this case, the little subscript I is a person, j is a time point, and this is actually from a multivariate model, so the k is in there. Just copied this over from something else. As a few quick notes, too, on the logistic part of the model, the logit there and the log, I actually have two separate sets of predictors. You can have the same set of predictors in both parts of the model, or you can have different sets of predictors. It's just kind of on theoretical grounds what you think is reasonable. Also in the Poisson part of the model, where I have the log lambda there, I have a random effect, or the eta ik term. The reason I only have it in that part of the model, you can potentially fit random effects in both parts of the models. Just from my experience trying to model ZIP models with longitudinal data, it can be tricky to get the model to converge if you try to put a random effect in both parts of the model, even though it would be reasonable. And there are some tests out there that you can test whether you really need to account for zero inflation, whether the ZIP model actually provides a better fit than the Poisson model. There's a Vuong test statistic, which uses a likelihood ratio approach. There's also another score test available. I think the Vuong test statistic can be calculated in stata if you fit a ZIP model. So that is a nice feature of it. There's also a kind of an extension to the score test for hierarchical data, or if you have longitudinal data that you fit using a ZIP model. You can also, I guess to comment on this too, apart from fitting formal tests, you can also kind of look at your data and see if you have a high proportion of zeros, or if you assume the data is count data, you can just kind of do a quick and dirty, do a proc means or kind of summary and look at your mean and variance. And in a Poisson distribution, you assume that they're the same, so you can see if the variance is a lot larger or smaller than the mean. That can be an indication just without doing any formal testing. So I'm actually going to get into an example next where...
Can I ask a question?
Oh, sure.
The fitting, alluded to convergence issues. I gather there has to be some sort of iterative procedure, but can you describe that? I think the Poisson mean is the
Right.
statistic, and if the mean partly depends on the proportion of zeros, then sort of fit a proportion of zeros, and then I assume the MLE for the other PIJK is whatever's left over, but then I'm just curious
How it-
procedures work.
How it kind of decides where to place it.
If
I guess-
if you go back to the slide that you call number 30.
Yeah, right, this one here, yeah.
I think what they do, Tom, is combine everything into one likelihood, and then just go for the ML with the whole thing.
Does it converge in one step, or does it?
No, it is iterative. It is iterative.
A lot of times they use the EM algorithm, and it kind of, I think it has to be iterative most of the time, yeah.
Because I remember seeing, I've used this in Stata, and I remember seeing steps. And Stata has the process laid out. So as I recall, they just write the likelihood based on this model, and then go for all the parameters.
And the random effect in the Poisson part of the model, that's for...
This assumes in this particular case that you have longitudinal data. So if you want to put a random effect in random intercept, kind of adjust for that. So next I actually have an example from the CLEAR study where we fit a Poisson model originally, and then we went and fit a ZIP model and found different results. So just to give a little background on the CLEAR study, this was a behavioral intervention where we recruited HIV positive young people, ages 16 to 29, in 3 metropolitan cities. The entry criterion was they had to be substance users at baseline, and mostly gay men, mostly black and Latino. And we had 3 arms to this study. There was an in-person telephone intervention, and then a control, or really a delayed intervention, where they got whichever intervention worked better at the end. And they were followed for 15 months. The goal of the intervention was to reduce HIV transmission risk behaviors, specifically to reduce risky sexual behavior and substance use. So, anything to add, Dallas? I know Dallas is one of the people around while that was study was going on.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. So, in our original analyses that we published on this study, we looked at sexual behavior and drug use over time to see if the intervention impacted either. And we just fit Poisson regressions, and we fit logistic regressions for substance use, whether they used or not, and sexual behavior, whether they were abstinent or not. And we actually didn't find anything in the original analyses. So one problem we found with this is we asked participants at each assessment, they were assessed at approximately 3 months, how many times they used any one of a number of substances. And for most of the substances, participants said they didn't use them. Here's an example at baseline for methamphetamine use. The leftmost bar there is the proportion of zeros. So as you can see, there's a pretty high, am I blocking? All right, it should be shorter here. The leftmost bar is a proportion of 0 responses. So as you can see, for the data, there's a pretty high proportion of zeros. And this actually holds not just at baseline, but at each time point, we get a similar picture. So we just...
There were people who used methamphetamine over 400 times in 3 months.
Well, that's what they claimed. That's what they claimed. Yeah.
Maybe that explains some of the sex behavior.
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of an interesting point. This is one of our early studies before we started assessing using categories, where we found that actually framing, asking people, did you use once per week or 2 to 3 times per week, actually worked a lot better than just leaving it open-ended, say, enter any number that you want. That's kind of a process we've worked through.
Even though when we asked the question, we did frame it in terms of breaking it down on weekly use, just to get these huge ranges.
We asked it in actually 2 parts. The first part was how many times during the past 90 days, right? Mm-hmm. Or how many days?
Right.
And then the average number of times per day, and then we multiplied those 2 quantities together. That's what we did. So yeah, overall we have a high percentage of 0 counts. So there's really 2 possibilities for the 0 counts here. There can be non-users, where participants, or we call this in the 0 state, or if you have a 0, it can just be a user that's not using when the person is interviewed. So we actually analyzed this data using a ZIP model more recently. And we found when we
start with those responses at baseline as well as the follow-up period.
Yes.
Is there any indication of underreporting going on in drug use? Like those zeros, those 2 states?
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't assess that. We did do a biological comparison where we took blood samples or urine samples, right, from some participants. But the problem is we only took the urine samples in the people that said they didn't use. No, wait, they did use. Was that it, Dallas? I think there was something where we only assessed it in the people that said they used. So if they didn't use, we didn't have any check to make sure that they weren't under-reporting. So that's a good question. We just didn't have a way to check for that.
Before you describe those of them, as I recall, the standard command in Stata is zip, which is not longitudinal.
Right.
Was there a user-supplied one that did the longitudinal piece?
That's a good question. I actually fit this model in WinBugs, taking a Bayesian approach.
So you did it yourself. Okay.
I did it myself, but you can also fit longitudinal zip models in SAS. You can use the proc-NL mix procedure and then just specify your own likelihood.
Okay.
That's another way to do that. So we found different results using this longitudinal zip model, and we found that the intervention did impact a number of the drugs. So just, I don't know if that's too small, you can see that.
Okay.
So we did have a reduction across a number of the drugs in both intervention arms. We found a few surprises where cocaine use actually increased over time, but overall, like with methamphetamine use or meth, that actually went down. And this is a picture of methamphetamine use over time. These are the estimated number of times using from the ZIP model. So the green line on top, I know it's kind of hard to see with the little legend, but the green line on top is the delayed group or the control group. So the in-person and the telephone groups, although I know the telephone group looks like it's just shifted down, but there was some decreases in that as well over time. So I'm going to talk about some extensions to the ZIP model, and this is probably a good place for some discussion too, because really, if you look at the literature to deal with zero inflated data, or just what they call over dispersed or under dispersed data, there's quite a bit of literature out there on different ways to analyze this. Just to touch briefly on some work I did on my dissertation to actually extend the model. The ZIP model, I just called it a hierarchical ZIP model. And to give an example from the clear data, if you have longitudinal substance use data, you can potentially have more than one zero state. Two zero states you could have would be the first zero state. You could have non-use across all time points and substances if you're assessing multiple substances over time. And then you can also have a zero state for someone who is non-using at a given time point in a particular substance. So an example of this, you can have participants who are just non-users of any drugs, so that would be in one zero state, or you could have participants who are, say, users of lighter drugs. Maybe they just drink or they use marijuana, but they don't use the hard drugs, so they'll tend to be in the zero state for the hard drugs. So you can kind of take advantage of the hierarchy to the zeros that the data offers. And you can fit a ZIP model with two zero states. So I actually fit this ZIP model in WinBugs. I'm sure there's probably a way to do it in SAS. I'm not sure how. WinBugs makes the code fairly simple. I found some code from Congdon's book, and he gives a lot of WinBugs programs that made this possible. So in the model that I fit to the clear data, I modeled the probability of men being in the zero state across all time points and substances, or just being non-users. I tested a gender effect for that. And for the second part of the model, I tested the probability of being in the zero state over time for each substance. So in that case, time was the predictor to be in the second zero state. And then for the Poisson part, I tested the intervention effect. And I guess this is kind of small. I took the lazy approach and kind of cut and pasted this in from something else. But just looking at this, the top part there, next to male in that same row where I have an estimate of minus 1.03, we see there was a gender effect where men were less likely to be in the zero state for substance use across all substances in time, or men were less likely to be non-users, period. Looking at time testing for time effects, or being in the zero state for three of the substances, we have amphetamines and cocaine and methamphetamine. We see there are some effects, some time effects for it being in the zero state. And then on the bottom there, the blue is the intervention effect, which is often the part that the researchers are really interested in. As a brief comment on this, because this model is kind of complex to fit, it's hard to get covariates to work in the logistic parts of the model where you're trying to model the zero states to fit multiple zeros. So that could be one potential problem with trying to fit this model.
And just to be clear, the substance-specific zero states, on your previous slide, the second bullet point, it's
let me go back.
those are, in a sense, the probability of being in the zero state over time for each substance conditional on not being in the non.
Exactly. I forgot to add that part. It is conditional on not being in the previous zero state. That's true. Yeah, that's an important point.
So that helps.
Yeah.
And that's actually that helps in that.
Right.
That makes it then similar to the two-part model in a sense.
It is, yes. It is similar to the two-part model.
Yeah.
So jumping back to the ZIP model, getting away from the longitudinal data or the hierarchy, if you have cross-sectional data, in addition to the data being zero inflated, it might contain extreme values. Looking at the drug data, you can have a zero inflated drug data that actually has heavy users in the same sample, so you get really long tails. So one way to handle this is to fit a zero inflated negative binomial model, or ZINB model, I guess. So you can replace the Poisson part of the model with the negative binomial distribution. And there are score tests, and I believe a likelihood ratio test as well, to compare the ZIP and the zero inflated negative binomial model.
Couldn't you do that by putting a gamma prior on the lambda? Or does that not work?
Yeah, but then they just use the density of the negative binomial. They don't actually split it up like the way stat of it. They just, instead of using the Poisson density function, they use the negative binomial density. But,
Oh, is that the way Stata does it?
yeah, and they have the likelihood ratio as well.
Oh, okay, they do have that built in. Okay. I didn't put this in the slide, but just a comment. There's also, which is very similar to the zero inflated negative binomial model, there's the zero inflated generalized Poisson model, which uses the generalized Poisson distribution instead. From what I gathered in the literature, it seems that the generalized Poisson model it adds more flexibility, but because it's not it doesn't come from the exponential family. Let's get that. It's not a generalized likelihood model, so it's not as readily fit in a lot of the common software packages if you take that approach. But there is a module in the R software library if you want to fit a zero inflated generalized linear model. So moving on here. There's another approach you can take too, and you can actually apply a Markov model to longitudinal ZIP or zero inflated negative binomial model. And one of the assumptions that we make when we fit a longitudinal ZIP or zero inflated negative binomial model is that the probability of being in the zero state is the same regardless of whether the event occurred in the previous time point. So to give a practical example of this from drug use data, when we model a ZIP model, longitudinal, and you assess drug use over time, you assume the probability of being in the zero state for non-use is the same whether or not the person was in their zero state in the previous time point. So a lot of times this is okay if you just want to know whether or not your intervention worked. A lot of times you're just interested in the overall trend and you don't care if people are bouncing in and out of the zero stated individual time points, and the longitudinal ZIP or zero inflated negative binomial model might suffice. But there might be cases where you might be interested in what actually happens between individual time points, and you might actually pick some up additional power using a Markov model. So there is literature out there for fitting both a ZIP and a zero inflated negative binomial model with hidden Markov chains. And just to try to summarize this in a slide, I guess you can estimate the transition probabilities for moving in and out of the zero state over time. And for reference on this, with Wang and Alba, they actually modeled using I believe it was a zero inflated negative binomial model, foreign direct, a count of the number of foreign direct investments over time, and they looked at predictors of those investments. And I wanted to make a comment on this too, which I'd forgotten way back in the beginning, just to kind of touch on something. I want to thank Fifi first for the background for the slides. I took those from him. But I also wanted to comment on a paper I just came across, and I didn't want to drive Alan nuts and add another slide at the last minute, but I just come across it, a paper that a Fifi worked, is the first author on with a few people. It's a 2007, I believe, in the annual review. And one of the things that was, one of the things I thought was really nice in that paper is they did a comparison of the two-part model for semi-continuous data in the ZIP model, where you fit that to the number of nights stayed in a hospital. And I think in that paper, I forgot what the finding was exactly. It was something where you came to the same conclusion, but the results were a little different.
Quantitatively, they were different, but significance-wise,
they were the same. Okay, well, I thought that was interesting. And I have quite a few references here. And I guess that's pretty much it. So I'll open the floor to questions.
I have a practical question.
Sure.
I've been trying to run some of these ZIP models with SAS and frequently they frequently do not converge.
Right.
Is Stata better?
If
Would Stata be more likely to converge?
If you don't have longitudinal Stata
won't do longitudinal?
not for ZIP, unless they have a new user supplied one that I haven't seen. I didn't look for one. So you might want to look and see if they do have a user supplied module or whatever they call it that handles longitudinal. And if so, it would probably be better than the SAS ones.
Just to add on to that too, sometimes WIN bugs can provide fits if you provide different prior information. I guess the caution there is with WIN bugs, it's not usually a problem that they don't converge, but you have to really check the diagnostics carefully because they might converge very slowly. So you have to really check the diagnostics to trust your estimates. But I have found sometimes you can get models to fit in WIN bugs that will blow up in SAS.
Most anything will blow up in SAS.
Yeah.
SAS even, like I give preliminary values of 0 and run it and get some estimated coefficients. If you were to take those estimated coefficients and put them in as preliminary values,
It won't converge.
no, you get completely different answers.
Yeah, that's
You
true.
not trust anything.
That happens sometimes. Sometimes I've fit separate models, like a logistic model in SAS and a linear model in SAS, and use those as starting values in WIN bugs. Sometimes that helps.
The key is to just do it once and not get any contradictory
Right.
information.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So, across the various projects that you're working on at the center, have you been able to, because I'm thinking we have several measures that we're interested in that this issue applies, whether it's sexual behavior, drug use, any other issues. So have you been doing those? And if so,
We have, I think, is kind of a standard procedure now. Well, we tend to run the simple model first, and if we find significance, hey, we quit. But no, I'm just well, that happens a lot, where we run the simpler model first, where we might, for example, fit a Poisson regression to, substance use counts or sexual behavior to see if we find anything, and also look at the distribution of the data. And I know in some of the projects like HLP, I think, Kate, with the homeless paper, we've been using zip models.
Yeah, I got it to work for one paper, but then for another paper, we ended up, like, sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 outcome variables, and maybe the zip models will converge for 2 of them. So on those, I might just use a Poisson regression, so you don't have to have any method section. Well, I use these because this model, because these ones converge, but
Right.
you can use it here. You just do the lowest common denominator.
And then also with the HLP data, it has close to 1,000 people that are assessed over time. If you have smaller data sets, it might not work either.
I think this is an important issue, like for current projects as well as like the new projects that are coming up. I'm wondering, as a statistician, would it be, in terms of, you know, at the stage where the researchers are developing questionnaires, would it be like a good idea for statisticians to get involved in finding out ways to, you know, ask those sexual behavior drug questions, so that, like in terms of zeros, whether you can specifically ask whether it's, you know, 0 I've never used in my life versus 0 I haven't
Right.
used it in the past 3 months. So instead of assuming there's 2 different states, you clearly have responses from participants, whether it's like I've never used it versus I used it before but not during this assessment period.
Right. I think that's an important point, because I think the time frame when events actually happened are often lost.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I guess like you can be proactive to
right.
bother the PIs and
Right.
let them know that it has implications
Well,
for the like future.
I mean,
analysis.
kind of a separate issue, but tied into that is that, you know, like Kate and I have found with the HLP study, where when we did this study with Dallas, we tried to assess just the raw frequencies, and that didn't work so well because people gave these wild answers. So more recently, we've gone to framing the responses. But then when we go to do the analyses,
So
we categorically.
1 is 1 and say
Right.
5 is 100 to
Right,
200.
right.
But the interesting thing is then when you go to analyze it, how do you treat it? You end up, you know, one approach we took with an HLP article was we converted the categories back to counts. You know, we said, well, if they said they used once in the past 90 days, it should be this count. But then we got criticized, of course.
Come back and said, well,
Yeah.
what are you doing with this categorical variable?
Right.
You transformed it into a count variable. And not even
Yeah.
transformed. It's like a no win.
Yeah. So it's not really an easy solution to how to handle those kinds of measures.
So it seems like when we were comparing the Poisson, the zip to the ZINB, it's clear that the one is nested in the other.
Right.
But if you're comparing zero inflated Poisson to a Poisson regression, it's clear that the one is nested within another, but I would wonder about whether the likelihood ratio test statistic would be chi-square distributed, or maybe, you know,